Okay, I think we can get started with this fourth session of the Knowledge Guided Machine Learning Workshop, this one about KGML and the Aquatic Sciences. I'm Allison Appling with the U.S. Geological Survey, and my co-chair is Paul Hansen with the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And we wanted to just cover some logistics briefly. Most of this will be familiar to you if you've been in sessions already in this workshop, but a reminder that we're doing questions via Slido. And so you can find the link on the workshop webpage, or you can use your phone to grab this QR code here to get over to that Slido link. Of course, please be respectful and concise with your questions. We know you will. Also unique to this session so far is that we have asked all of our poster and oral presenters to show up for the last 25 minutes of the session to join in a panel discussion about KGML and the aquatic sciences. So if you have questions and would like to talk with all of this group of presenters, we'll all be there then. If you didn't have a chance to join the poster session that ran over the last hour, my understanding is that GatherTown will still be open to you today and tomorrow, and so we really encourage you to get back to those posters and catch up on any that catch your eye as we mention them today. And on the right, we have a schedule of all of the aquatic sciences contributions for the day, and want to thank you all very much for preparing these talks and posters and bringing some exciting ideas to the table. Paul and I are going to start out with an introduction to Aquatic Sciences KGML, and I'm going to let Paul take it away for the first few slides.
Great, thanks, Allison, and welcome everybody to the Aquatic Sciences session. And as Allison said, she and I are going to tag team and hand off this introductory talk between each other. We have a few goals for the introduction. One is to define KGML within the context of aquatic sciences and identify some of the functions KGML can perform in our field and relate that functionality to the scientific process. We'll preview how current work exemplifies the different applications and approaches to KGML. And to get you thinking about some of the science addressed in the presentations, we'll point to frontiers in the applications of KGML and aquatic sciences. By the end of the session, we also hope that you're inspired to think about ways in which machine learning may be combined with your expertise to advance aquatic sciences. Next slide, please. So the text graphic that you see on the first slide in the upper left of this slide as well is meant to symbolize the inseparability of knowledge guidance and machine learning. There's a perception that machine learning, when it's used alone, can be an unguided black box used for expediency just to get better predictions. However, all aquatic science machine learning applications have at least some knowledge guidance, as illustrated here by the fact that even the stick figure in the cartoon, the stick figure's attempt to do fully data-driven modeling still requires that they stir the pile and somehow recognize when it looks right, which cannot be done with knowledge of how it should look in the first place. So our goal with KGML is to be intentional about how traditions of our discipline can work together with machine learning techniques in lots of different ways, ranging from how ideas are conceived to how algorithms and workflows are built and how results are interpreted. Effective KGML is also built on a foundation of understanding among disciplines, and so there's an important interdisciplinary component that deserves attention too. Thus, for our purposes today, we define KGML as the purposeful integration of data science with aquatic sciences knowledge that takes many different forms that you've seen already in the workshop and that we'll survey in this talk. Next slide, please. These are just a few of the benefits and their importance to aquatic science, and this echoes some of what you've seen in Vipin Kumar's opening talk and previous talks too. Accurate and explainable predictions are important to our stakeholders, whether we're predicting floods or the probability of a harmful algal bloom or an anoxic fish kill event. Data availability can be a big problem in our field, especially for chemical and biological variables. Often we don't have the necessary data to fully use new deep learning techniques. In other words, our big data often are big in their diversity rather than in their volume. And KGML has been shown to help address this problem. And this capacity also translates into confidence in applying models trained on data-rich systems to data-poor systems. Updating our understanding of the way the world works is foundational to science. KGML provides opportunities to test our conceptual and quantitative models by providing a range of model insights, from parameterization to model structure to clues about what may be ecologically important, but maybe that we forgot to put in our models in the first place. Finally, at least for this list, KGML provides a means to avoid that rabbit hole of increased process model complicatedness. Models can take on a life of their own and become way over parameterized. It's true for both machine learning and for process-based models. And the architectures of KGML can be highly flexible, allowing us to use parsimonious models from Aquatic Sciences, along with machine learning algorithms to attain better performance that we get from either approach alone. Next slide, please. So we are desperate for advancements in our field. The challenges put forth by the National Academy in their 2018 report are just some of the many challenges that we're facing. The difficulty in understanding how to address these challenges becomes compounded as we move from the physical realm up through the chemical and biological realms, in part because the data become more sparse and the system characteristics become more complex. We'll see a number of examples, especially relevant to physical variables such as water temperature. We have fewer examples in chemistry and biology, but please do go back and have a look at the posters, which do have a couple of examples in water quality. Both our questions and our data are big. Sometimes our data volumes aren't big, but at least they're big in their heterogeneity. And we need these approaches, such as KGML, that enable us to harness these data to meet the very real needs. Alice.
So there are a number of ways that we can use modeling to address these big questions, these really real aquatic sciences needs. And here is a schematic of a couple of the major ways that we can use any kind of model. So we can go from observed data on the left, and we can use models to make inferences about the underlying processes and parameters of a model, usually by fitting or calibrating a model. And these inferences provide one form of understanding and answers. And then we can also use those fitted models to make predictions, which lead to a different form of understanding, which is grounded more in patterns and scenarios. For example, here are the trends in lake clarity over the last few decades, or if you add a riparian buffer near this stream, here are the changes you can expect in biodiversity. People who are new to machine learning sometimes make the oversimplification that it's all about predictions, but in fact, machine learning offers much more than that. It expands the number of pathways that we can use to get from observations to understanding by quite a few. So on top of these pathways in gray, we can now also go straight from observations to predictions without defining specific parameters to calibrate. And we can extract inferences from predictive models using feature importance and explainable AI methods. There's also this entirely new step of distillation made possible by methods like clustering and autoencoders and other forms of dimension reduction, which take a complex data set and make sense out of it. So now we can remember better, we can discuss, we can develop hypotheses based on that more distilled information. And then all of these pathways, whether they're in gray here or blue, can be enhanced with knowledge-guided machine learning. KGML allows us to make more accurate predictions, lets us make richer inferences about the underlying processes, and allows us to distill information more meaningfully into information that we can digest. In the aquatic sciences, we're making use of all three of these pathways regularly to answer our science questions. And so here I've taken the collection of posters and talks from this session and some other aquatic sciences talks within the workshop and just clustered them into these three pathways. One thing that we can see here is that our strongest representation is in this prediction pathway. So yeah, prediction is important for machine learning, but almost 2/3 of today's presentations also use inference or distillation to get down to information. What this says to me, this diversity of KGML approaches, is that there's almost no question in the aquatic sciences that can't benefit from KGML. And that brings us back to this starting idea from the presentation, which is that it's one thing to just stir that pile, like to apply knowledge guidance without acknowledging what you're doing. But it's much more valuable to use knowledge guidance intentionally and to use more powerful tools than a canoe paddle. Given that there are so many pathways from observations to understanding, it's also no surprise that we see a diversity of approaches to knowledge guidance. And so in the next 6 slides, I'm going to walk through some of the recurring themes that we see in this session for how aquatic scientists are using knowledge guidance with intention to support their research. So knowledge guidance begins at the very start of the modeling process in the data preparation phase. Most of the presentations you'll see today will include some expert-based selections of the predictors that are going into the model. And some efforts are also using feature engineering to extract even more targeted information. For example, Kazuto Masaba created these high-level descriptors of storm events rather than passing in the raw time series of precipitation to provide a more meaningful input variable. And Carlotta Valerio's poster showed engineering of the variables that the machine learning model was asked to predict, in those cases, metrics of species richness for native or alien species. Another approach to knowledge guidance addresses the guts of the machine learning model itself. So here researchers are designing the structure of their machine learning models to reflect the structure of the real world. Several of today's presentations describe uses of LSTMs or other time-aware models to predict or distill time series variables. Sam Oliver and Janet Barclay discussed the use of graph convolution to reflect spatial relationships among stream reaches. And then Shuki Lin shared this approach to chlorophyll prediction that involves some intermediate variables for nutrient concentrations. So those are predicted in this first machine learning step and then used as input into that second learning step that predicts chlorophyll A. Another way that we can do this is embed knowledge within the loss functions that we use to train our models. And this is an area where we've seen a lot of creativity in recent years and hope to see more in the future. Loss functions that encourage mass balance or energy balance have been used in several recent studies and have a lot of power. And then Janet Barclay today is going to share a couple of new metrics that are enforcing this situation-appropriate temporal signal, a seasonal pattern in the relationship between water temperature and air temperature that should vary with how much groundwater influence there is in a site. And so her loss function terms enforce that fairly complicated relationship. And then Robert Ladwig has proposed a loss function term that leverages the observed power spectrum of dissolved oxygen concentrations, similar to what Paul Hansen shared last year for phosphorus, but this time looking at dissolved oxygen and aiming to create a more realistically smooth time series of predictions. So going from this black line here without that loss function term to the purple line here once we've added in that effectively smoothing power spectrum loss term. We can also make use of process-based models as a source of knowledge guidance. And so these can be used to pre-train a machine learning model before fine-tuning that model on observations, as Sam Oliver and Janet Barclay are doing. And they can also be the focus of a study such as Moritz Fegel's, where he predicts residuals between observations and process-based predictions to understand where and why the process-based model does better or worse. Knowledge guidance comes into play around how our models are assessed as well. For example, Titan Alkan looked not just at the accuracy of his wave height predictions compared to observations, but also at whether those predictions were capturing realistic trends and extremes in wave heights. Sam Oliver assesses her water temperature forecasts based in part on their ability to predict exceedances of this ecologically meaningful temperature threshold for fish health. Model evaluation on its own doesn't constitute knowledge-guided machine learning in the sense that it doesn't always get into the machine learning model, but it can informally. It does in the sense that as modelers are iteratively developing their models and learning from assessments like these, they can then adjust things like their model structures or inputs or loss functions to better capture these metrics that they do want to hit. And lastly, from me, today's presentation shows how we can use machine learning also to strengthen our conceptual models in the aquatic sciences. Several studies today use feature importance assessments or attribution to learn about the drivers of water quality and other ecosystem properties. Heather Wander's poster showed uses of autoencoders and clustering to identify common and meaningful patterns in lake areas over time. And Anush Karpatni will be presenting later on the use of explainable AI, looking to learn why their machine learning model sometimes disagrees with experts on which fish species is present in a photo, which has led to the discovery of new fish species traits. All of these techniques I've covered are about enhancing these model pathways, all of them, from observations through to understanding. In other words, they're using knowledge-guided machine learning to guide the creation of new knowledge. To me, this diversity of pathways and this diversity of approaches to KGML all means there are huge opportunities here, both to answer these pressing aquatic sciences research questions that we have, and also to continue discovering new ways, new methods to better answer those questions.
So Allison and I have put 3 resolutions on the table for this afternoon. First, let's push ourselves. Many important advances in aquatic sciences have come from borrowing ideas and methods from other disciplines and from collaborating at the seams between disciplines. And KGML is inherently interdisciplinary. Let's be creative in how we envision use of these techniques while always being mindful of the best we've learned from our discipline. And in the spirit of some of the caveats that, for example, Peter Dubin raised earlier about KGML, let's also keep a critical eye on the pros and the cons of the technique. And finally, the water's warm and welcoming. So please do wade in with us and join us. You may imagine there are some monsters lurking beneath the surface. And this is a photo of Pineview Reservoir in Utah. And it was falsely rumored that there were bull sharks that were introduced into the lake. But really, I think what's in there are these endemic piscivorous fish. They're all part of the ecosystem. They're meant to be there, and they're not so scary once you get to know them. So come on in. It's a safe space in which to play and to have fun. And the last slide. So these are the kinds of issues that are beginning to be addressed by the posters we've seen in the presentations that we're about to hear. These are familiar and difficult frontiers in aquatic sciences. They include interpreting and understanding machine learning output, improved predictions, and a deeper understanding of uncertainty and how that feeds back to, for example, model design, the collaborative process that's needed for effective interdisciplinary teams, and what we can do to foster those collaborations. These frontiers are consistent with the larger goals of science. I think we've seen these issues popping up all week long, and I suspect we'll see them come in other forms tomorrow as well. And KGML provides an exciting and a fun new context to make progress. So as Allison had said earlier, thank you so much to our poster presenters, and those posters are still up, and please go back and have a look at the posters if you haven't had a chance to do that. And thank you in advance to our presenters who will be showing their work here shortly. So that's it for the introductory talk. Allison, I'm not sure we have time for any questions, and we should probably get set up for our first talk.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think we can move at a relaxed pace into Charu's talk here. So the first speaker, and I'll stop sharing. The first speaker will be Charuleka Varadharajan of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And she'll be talking about multi-scale machine learning models to develop a predictive understanding of the impacts of disturbances on river water quality.
Can everyone see my screen here?
Yes.
So should I wait till it's 11:50 or should I just start?
Yeah, let's wait just a few seconds.
Just let me know when I should go.
All right, let's go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you to Allison and Paul for inviting me for this workshop and for a really great introduction to our session. I think they've set up my talk really well and several of the other talks. So I'm Charu Varadharajan. I'm a research scientist in the Earth and Environmental Sciences area at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I'm also a research affiliate with the Berkeley Institute of Data Sciences. So I'm a biogeochemist and use a lot of data science methods in my research. And this particular work is from a project that's looking to predict the impacts of extreme disturbances such as floods and droughts on river water quality. And I really like how Allison had set us up for this term of predictive understanding here that's in the title, which is really this intersection of inference, predictions, and distillation. Really, all of that comes together, and that's really why that term predictive understanding is used here. So the reason why water quality, for those of you who are not very familiar, consists of several physical, chemical, and biological variables in the water, in particular rivers here. And it's really important for the biota that live in the streams, as well as human health and other ecosystem services. And so water managers have to meet certain water quality criteria, and they need these sorts of robust predictions at multiple scales, regional to basin scales, subdaily to decadal temporal scales, so they can make optimal decisions when they want to think about how they manage your water resources for the long term. Now, unfortunately, it is the extreme events such as floods and droughts actually negatively impact water quality. Here on the left, you see this picture. This is actually from an earlier heat wave, but we saw a recent heat wave in the Pacific Northwest where a lot of fish were really affected, and fish populations decreased substantially because of this massive heat wave that took place in the Pacific Northwest. And on the right, you see how there are lots of billions of dollars actually being invested across several places where these sorts of negative impacts happen to prevent these. So in this case, California in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is trying to prevent saltwater intrusion into this very sensitive ecosystem. And if you looked at the IPCC report that just came out yesterday, unfortunately for us, floods, droughts, and heat waves are all going to increase in the next over the next century. So the goal here is to say, how do we understand and predict these impacts of extreme events on river water quality, and more importantly, determine what attributes of watersheds can make them more resilient to these types of disturbances, and using mostly data-driven approaches. And by data-driven, I include knowledge-guided machine learning. So this work builds on three major science questions that are really structured to add complexity and cross these different spatial scales. And the first question, which has been mostly what we've focused on for this last couple of years, is to understand how disturbances change water quality at a single location. So point to reach spatial scales at short and long time scales. And the second one starts to expand on the spatial scale and start to look at understanding impacts downstream along the river corridor and across river orders. And the third one starts to look at how landscape interactions with the rivers determine, and particularly watershed characteristics such as climate, land use, land cover, geology, all of these determine the watershed resilience to these disturbances, with the goal of finally coming up with some sort of a resilience index, which is a function of the disturbance as well as the watershed characteristics. So let's talk about some of the constraints we're dealing with. And Paul and Allison alluded to this earlier. First of all, disturbances can occur anywhere, anytime. So you have to be prepared to have a generalized model that works in many places. They can be multi-scale. So you can have local flood events that last a few days, and then you could have multi-year droughts that just span the entire Western US. So you have to be thinking about being able to scale up and scale down in your models. And you can have compound events. So you don't necessarily just have it, you can't look at the event individually at that time. You have to think about the system memory or the history. So if you had a long drought and then you had a flood, the system response could be very different if that prior drought hadn't occurred. So system memory matters, and sometimes the memory can be several years, not just a few months. And as mentioned earlier, we have very sparse data, and especially sparse data when you're thinking about extremes. By definition, they're extremes, and so there's not as much data there. And finally, water quality is just very complex. There are so many variables, there's so many drivers. So this picture here from a publication a few years ago kind of summarizes all the different factors that go into predicting river quality. And so what that means is there's going to be a lot of data that you really need, the complexity of the data that's needed to be doing accurate predictions here. So why are we interested in knowledge-guided machine learning? Now, there are Partly because process-based models are incomplete because there's just so much complexity, as I showed in the prior slide. And it's not just physics that we need to consider. We have chemistry, so reactive transport is really important for a lot of the variables, but you also have microbial reactions that mediate a lot of the water quality variables. And finally, but not the least, humans. And humans are, people, when we put fertilizers on our farms and they run off into streams, that causes a lot of water quality issues, for example. So there's so much, and it's so hard to sort of build process-based bottom-up models. So we don't really have good first principles-based models that work at large spatial scales and at high resolution. Those that exist tend to be over-parameterized for some regions, and they're just very expensive to run. But on the other hand, if you just think about black box machine learning, the data availability is really a problem, especially when you start to throw in all the other variables that you need for prediction. So if you say you want stream flow, as well as land use, as well as all these other things, and for the same period and for the same region, you start to really have very few regions where you have all the overlapping co-located variables. Another problem that we have is that because of the complexity of water quality and all the factors that can influence it, you end up dealing with very high dimensional data sets, and in some cases multimodal. You might need to consider remote sensing or geospatial information along with time series information. So it starts to then become computationally expensive when you're really thinking about such high dimensional data. So it generally tends to work when you have lots of data and simpler variables, but the moment you get into anything more than a simple problem you need knowledge-guided machine learning to guide how you do your feature selection and a lot of the other things that was mentioned earlier. So for this particular presentation, I'm focusing on stream temperature. That's one of the variables, but we're also looking at salinity and dissolved oxygen. And temperature is kind of a favorite for knowledge-guided machine learning, I think, because it does behave physically, and there are physical equations that we can use to constrain stream temperature. And similarly, salinity tends to be mostly conserved species, so you can use physical models for predictions. But once you get into dissolved oxygen, that's where a lot of the reactive transport, microbial processes, and human influences start to come into the picture. So it is more complex. Oops, okay, here. So the objectives for our machine learning models, first of all, were to develop these models for water temperature, but our goal and our objective is different from a lot of what you're going to see in this session. We're not focused on forecasting. We're really focused on understanding the drivers of water temperature across these different regions and these disturbance events. So for that purpose, we chose low to intermediate complexity models that are more interpretable. So regression models, which is support vector regression, random forest, mixed boost. And what we wanted to do was to start to expand to different scales. So here you see in this figure, we started with the point scale, which are individual stations, and then we wanted to go to stations using one model for multiple stations and start to build up regionally. Now, this is where I was just telling you about the data availability problem. Once you start to impose a constraint saying, I just want stations with at least 20 years of water temperature data, you have dramatically fewer stations than if you just say, I want any station that had any water temperature data. And we wanted longer periods of record, primarily because of the focus on disturbances. These can occur, over several, they don't occur all the time. So you do need a longer record when you're specifically focused on disturbances. I would also say that we started with monthly water temperature, since that is a pretty common time scale for this kind of disturbance analysis, but and especially for droughts or something like that, which can occur over very long periods. So the data sources that we used were meteorology, which we used a gridded product called DayMet, which is at 1 kilometer resolution, gives you several different variables, and water temperature and discharge from the USGS National Water Information System. And we did look at some exploratory data analysis. The figure on the right showing you several different processes that can impact stream temperature. And based on this, we just said that we could start with these few variables. It's important to say that solar radiation is actually a very important variable for stream temperature, and not all the meteorological forcings that are available typically have solar radiation. So PRISM, which is very popular, for example, doesn't have solar radiation. So that was one of the factors that went into choosing DayMet. And for now, we're running this at the Mid-Atlantic and Pacific Northwest regions. And we were looking at both pristine and human impacted regions and down selected to 75 stations that had a minimum of 20 years of data. So first we did this at the individual point scales where you have single stations. And that's, we got pretty good predictions for the majority of the stations. By pretty good, I mean your root mean squared error of less than a degree Celsius. And that's just using very simple inputs, these meteorology, the month of the year to indicate seasonality and discharge. But a few stations had higher error, and we suspected that might have been because of the human impacts. So what we then did was to look at the feature importance, which there were several talks earlier this morning that kind of indicates this. This we were using mostly to test what were the variables that really the model was picking up on for these two different models. And it turns out that mean air temperature is the most important variable, at least for our models. And just keep that in mind because that's important when we talk about it later on. So we now try to use what knowledge we had gained at these simple models, at these monthly point scale models, but then translate that to building these generalized models for these 75 stations across these different regions. But now we know there were some stations that didn't do as well at the point scale. So we were hypothesizing that maybe the water temperature dynamics are different for free-flowing reaches versus dammed reaches. And so we classified these stations using an approach that was in a recent paper. And that's just looking at the number of major dams in a basin. And we built two separate models for the two separate groups, but added three basic station attributes as predictors, which is lat, long, and elevation. And we intentionally chose these three attributes because these are broadly available metadata. As we heard earlier, you may not have basin characteristics for all that are available for all locations. And we wanted to be really able to predict these water temperatures at any location, partly because disturbances can occur anywhere. So what we're finding is there is a bit of a trade-off in accuracy, but generalized models are doing pretty well. These are early results, and we're going to refine some of our hyperparameter optimization. So hopefully you can improve upon this accuracy of 1.5 degrees Celsius. But there are some stations that show poor performance at extremes, and there may be some bias that we have to correct. But in general, we have pretty decent accuracy for most of these free-flowing stations. But for the dammed stations, there were some stations that did really well. Just using the simple model, we could actually predict dammed flow water temperatures pretty well. But there were some that didn't do well. And what we found was actually that gauges dam classification, although it helped reduce this computational cost, didn't really help us in any way. So what we know now is that just separating by that particular method of saying this is dammed versus undammed is not really helping, and that we need some other means of classification of these different stations to figure out what might help improve our accuracy. So what we're now doing is to look at these time series dynamics of these signals and then trying to cluster them here using mostly their statistical properties. And what we're realizing is actually the behavior of these different signals are different compared to the prior grouping by major dams in the basin. So now what we're trying to do is to look at the watershed attributes and seeing what contributes to these different time series dynamics. So just a few key takeaways. Just injecting a little bit of knowledge. This is not fully the knowledge guided machine learning where you have process-based models or equations or something. This is just a little bit of knowledge into your low complexity black box machine learning. Actually works pretty well for stream temperature, and it makes it much more interpretable and computationally less expensive than deep learning models. And using very simple inputs such as meteorology, basic attributes, means that you can actually predict water temperatures anywhere, which is kind of what you need for the disturbances. And we also find that they're fairly transferable between the two hydrologic regions that we studied, the Pacific Northwest and the Mid-Atlantic. But a few things, caveats. Our early results indicate that once you start to change scales, the machine learning models and input features are not exactly the same. So I showed you a case where we went from point scale to regional scale, and we already had to add a few attributes like lat, long, and elevation. Now we tried this from going from monthly to daily, and we find that that's not, again, we need to add a lot more variables primarily because the physics is actually different at these different timescales. The processes that impact water temperature at monthly timescale could be mostly air temperature. Whereas when you go to daily, you're going to need solar radiation, you're going to need groundwater, you're going to need a snow melt, a lot of other things. When you go to sub-daily, there's an extra set of processes to be considered, which may be shading, maybe wind mixing. There's a lot more complexity as you start to go down scales. And so unfortunately, the question I have in my mind is, can we ever have one model to rule them out across scales? Maybe, maybe not. I think the jury's out on this. But as you start to translate scales, well, you have to think about the physics itself being different. And that's important. And this is why knowledge-guided machine learning is really helpful for these sort of scale translations. So finally, I want to just end saying, since I started out with disturbances as a sort of a theme here, what we're doing with these models now is trying to understand the heat wave impacts on water temperature. So remember that I said that, air temperature turned out to be the most important predictor, which for us meant that more than floods and droughts, heat waves are actually a really important disturbance for water temperature. And so here I'm showing a few months in the Pacific North, 2 stations in the Pacific Northwest. One is a free-flowing reach on the top, one is a dammed reach on the bottom, and looking at a massive heat wave that occurred in 2015. And what we're seeing is that for the top, actually, the water temperature signal follows very closely the air temperature. And that's partly because of the equilibration can happen very quickly. But in these dammed reaches, initially, when there was a release, the water temperature went down, but look, over time, actually, the water temperature is not necessarily, keeping it cool. So this is the kind of things we're now trying to say. We built these machine learning models at these scales, and then let's try to apply that to study the impacts of heat waves. So with that, I just want to end and thank everyone for your attention. This work is mostly going to be written up in a paper that we hope to submit very soon. And here's our website for the project. You can keep track of all our publications. I also want to say, and I also want to acknowledge Helen Weierbach, who did a lot of the work I presented today, and Misha Lubitsch, a summer intern with me. So one thing that you all might find useful is the Department of Energy, which funded this work, had a recent call for white papers for AI for persistent processes earlier this year. And there are about hundreds of white papers that have been released on this link here on this website. Several of them call it knowledge-guided machine learning. A few of us submitted a white paper on using machine learning for predicting impacts of extreme water cycle impacts on river water quality. So that's a paper, that's the DOI there, but I would encourage you all to go and read many of the other white papers and interesting ideas on that site. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Charo. What a great start to this session. And thanks also for those links to the DOE white papers. We have a couple of questions already in Slido, and I want to remind the attendees that Slido is the place to be putting your questions to get Charo to answer them. One easy one, potentially, someone says, maybe I missed this, but was there a type of model that generally performed best out of the machine learning models that were used, like XGBoost or Random Forest?
Yeah, the XGBoost and the Random Forest were somewhat comparable. For different stations, actually, some of them were slightly different, but more or less, they all were sort of similar, and they all beat the baseline models, which was the persistence, the multilinear regression, and some historical means. So I would say that it's, the Random Forest and XGBoost are very comparable, more or less.
Great. And then another question, is there a difference in extreme events for drivers versus extreme events as responses? And is machine learning better at predicting the fat tails of distributions and water quality?
Yeah, that's an interesting question here, partly because, we've thought about there's a way of thinking about extreme events and how that actually causes the change in water quality, which is different from finding the extreme events in the water quality signals themselves. And I think part of the machine learning models are not right now super suited for predicting extremes. And the problem is because the loss functions in general tend to bias towards the mean. The data are more biased towards the mean. So this, I think, is actually a really challenging area for research, is really thinking about how do you start to predict those extreme tails of the distribution. We thought about some ways like maybe training more heavily on data just for those extremes, or maybe just breaking up the regimes and treating those separately as drought regimes versus flood regimes. But I think this is a really active area of research.
Thanks. There are a couple more questions in Slido, but I'm going to ask that we switch over next to Sam Oliver, who's our next speaker. And then, Charo, if you can follow up and text responses to those in Slido, that'd be great. Thanks again. So our next speaker is Sam Oliver of the United States Geological Survey, and she'll be talking on process-guided deep learning for decision-ready predictions.
Thank you. I just have to figure out how to unmute myself and get my slideshow back. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you and see your slides.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so today I'm talking about process-guided deep learning for decision-ready predictions. My name is Sam Oliver. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a data scientist at the US Geological Survey. If you saw Jordan Reed's talk yesterday, that was a great introduction to this collaboration, which has been fueled by a long-term collaboration with Vipin Kumar's group at the University of Minnesota and Xiaowei Jia at the University of Pittsburgh. So what is the decision I'm talking about today? I want to focus on management decisions in the Delaware River Basin and how we can use process-guided deep learning to improve those decisions. To orient you, the Delaware River Basin is located in the Northeast United States. And in this basin, there are a series of reservoirs that serve a variety of human needs, including flood control, recreation, and drinking water. The reservoirs that get the most attention are those in the upper basin. Up here, those are owned by New York City, and they provide drinking water to over 15 million people in and outside of this basin. Water from these reservoirs is remarkably moved about 130 miles from the reservoirs through an aqueduct system. And these reservoirs have highly protected forested watersheds. The water from these reservoirs is clean enough that it can be provided unfiltered to the taps of New York City residents, which saves the city millions of dollars each year. There are several competing demands for these water resources in the basin, and one of those for water in the reservoir is to maintain the world-renowned trout fishery in the upper basin. Trout and other species are sensitive to high temperatures, and part of the flexible flow management program in the basin states that temperatures at the Lordsville gauge, which is in the upper basin, must remain below 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, there are various things that threaten to push water temperatures over 75 degrees, one of which is climate change and the observed increases in water temperatures both here in the basin and around the globe, but also things like land use change. But fortunately for reservoir managers, they're able to utilize the deep water release from the hypolimnion, or the cold water layer of the reservoir, to maintain downstream temperatures. The number of times the reservoir operator needs to make this decision is variable and based on weather. You can see here from their website, this is all of the days they made a thermal release. In 2020, it was very warm, and they had a number of extended expected exceedances where they were required to make a decision about releasing this limited amount of water. So the thermal bank is the set volume of water. It resets every water year, and so there's incentive to conserve it and make the decisions about whether or not you need it. So how do we go about modeling downstream water temperature from these downstream from these reservoirs? As Charu just pointed out, it's difficult to model stream temperature below these reservoirs. But first, I want to talk about what decision ready means to us in this context. So first, we needed to make predictions that had good enough accuracy and reliability to meet our stakeholder needs. We needed to deliver these forecasts at the time that they are needed. So daily, the reservoir operator is making decisions about what volume of water to release tomorrow. And the predictions also needed to contain the right information. Predictions from the model needed to be condensed in a way that was useful to the reservoir operator. The approach that we're taking to deliver decision-ready predictions is, of course, by using knowledge-guided machine learning, which is why we're here today. I'm not going to talk a lot about these methods that we built on, but I highly recommend this paper that I've linked to. As I said, our collaborator, Xiaowei Jia, published this paper earlier this year, and it has a lot of great context for this modeling effort. But I'll mention two things. First, a graph convolution network was used to leverage information across the stream network. And this helped improve performance across the Delaware River Basin for stream temperature, which is shown in this sort of pink distribution that you can see in the background. Second, we used pre-training on predictions from a process model to also inject process into our deep learning models. In the case of streams, we used predictions from the precipitation runoff modeling system, which was coupled with a stream temperature network model, which is a coupled flow temperature model that predicts temperature by solving a heat budget and sort of encodes our understanding of physical processes in the system. We use these predictions as truth, and we penalized the model when it made predictions that weren't similar to the predictions made by the process model. And in this way, the deep learning model is able to emulate a physical model before it ever sees real temperature observations. And you can see from the yellow distribution how that pre-training improved our ability to predict water temperature in the basin. So how do we go from Xiaowei's work in that publication to decision-ready predictions? Well, it'll take a lot. We needed to understand the specifics of the decision itself and how we needed to change our modeling approach to meet those criteria of the decision. For example, what is the decision cadence of the reservoir operator? What time of day are they issuing forecasts? And therefore, what's the latest possible time we can run the model? What's the latest possible time we can grab temperature observations from the real-time USGS network? What are the relevant locations in the Delaware River Basin where they want to know what the future water temperatures will be? We needed to automate these processes so that we could deliver them each day. So all sorts of different developments needed to happen in order to make these quote unquote decision ready. But there were two major pieces missing from our PGDL modeling framework that we've recently addressed that I want to highlight today. Those were improving our temperature predictions below reservoirs, which is a challenge, and also building data assimilation capacity into our modeling framework, which allowed us to incorporate the latest information to improve our predictions. So this is a graph of daily water temperature observations for a year in the Delaware River Basin to sort of demonstrate the problem of predictions below reservoirs. So the yellow line is showing you water temperature observations from a stream near Philadelphia. It's one of the warmest segments in the basin. And then the blue line is showing you temperature observations from below a reservoir. And you can see they look very different, just sort of high level. The reservoir observations are much cooler on average, except for, of course, the shoulder seasons, where the reservoir reaches are actually warmer than stream reaches. And you can see these bizarre signals of the reservoir releases that are sort of representing three major processes: stream temperature processes, reservoir temperature processes, and then human decision-making, which is really difficult to model. Lucky for us, the collaboration between USGS and our academic collaborators to model water temperature started in lakes, and Jordan Reed and others demonstrated that pre-training on process-based lake model predictions could improve predictions across all spectrums of data availability, which you're seeing in this figure. Similarly, in streams, the methods I just talked about from Xiaowei's paper, adding knowledge into our machine learning framework improved predictions across the Delaware River network, and particularly in places where we don't have a lot of data. So we started with Xiaowei's stream temperature model as a starting point, but we still had a lot of work, of course, to do in order to represent reservoirs. So like I said, our group had experience in both lakes and streams. So our first thought was we need a better pre-trainer. Right now, our PRMS SN-Temp pre-trainer is sort of, it's a natural flow model. It's not aware of reservoirs. And so we need a way to represent reservoirs. How do we get that into our process model pre-trainer? So we knew we could relatively easily spin up both a reservoir and stream process model. We did that, and then we asked ourselves, how can we combine these two models? How do we present this combined information to the neural network as a pre-trainer? And how do we do this in an efficient way? We don't want to take months to years to develop, say, a fully coupled process model. So how can we do this quickly as well? We landed on a pretty simple statistical method where we assumed that the relative influence of the reservoir temperatures would decay as a function of distance downstream from the reservoir. We fit an exponential decay function shown right here to existing stream temperature data below two reservoirs in the basin, Capacton and Cannonsville, to calculate the decay rate as a function of distance. So right below the reservoir, or distance set to 0, we weighted the reservoir predictions by 1 and the stream predictions by 0, and so on. And this figure up here is showing what that looks like over different distances. So closer to the reservoir, say at 10 kilometers, those reservoir predictions are weighted very heavily and look very similar to the GLM predictions that are predicting water temperature at the outlet depth of the reservoir. Closer to the stream, so say, further downstream from the reservoir, those predictions would look much more similar to PRMS SM temp predictions, where we assume the processes look more like stream temperature processes, and we downweight the reservoir processes. So how did this simple statistical combination of these two models improve our pre-trainer? Well, in conclusion, it did. This is an example of a site 15.8 kilometers downstream of the Cannonsville Reservoir. And you can see, especially compared to the gray line, which is our PRMS SM temp predictions, the combined model, which is shown in the blue line, greatly improves our predictions. And you can see the observations are there in black. So immediately downstream of these reservoirs, it about halved the root mean squared error of our predictions. So we're confident that this is going to give a better start to our deep learning models by pre-training with this combined statistical model. Okay, so we've made some progress on representing temperature dynamics below reservoirs. How do we accomplish this next point, which is incorporating the ability to include the latest information, so real-time data to improve our predictions. And we did that via data assimilation. We know that data assimilation is already happening in the heads of the reservoir operator. And the goal of this exercise was to formalize that into a modeling framework that would help us improve predictions. So on each day, the reservoir operator is using different pieces of knowledge about whether they should release water or not. And again, we're trying to formalize this process. In this case, the reservoir operator already had a model that was doing 1 day ahead forecasting. And so they have that model in hand to tell them what they think the temperature will be tomorrow. They can also look backwards at yesterday's temperature. How warm did it get yesterday? What was the weather forecast yesterday? Does that help me inform my decision today or tomorrow? The reservoir operator also has a sense of how that model is performing. They might think that weather forecasts in the upper basin are really crappy, and they know it usually rains more than the forecasts say it's going to. They might know that their temperature model historically over predicts in certain conditions. And so whether that's a formal bit of knowledge or it's all in their head, they're using that information to make decisions. So from a modeling perspective, what we want to do is say, okay, here we are, we're on day 0, we're trying to make a forecast for tomorrow. Let's look at how the model did yesterday. Well, the model is nearly perfect. Let's just trust the model and push forward and make tomorrow's prediction. When we move to tomorrow and all of a sudden the model does very poorly, we might want to nudge that model a little bit so that it makes better predictions into the future. And so the way that we did this was adding data assimilation to our deep learning framework. We started with a base LSTM that makes predictions of stream temperature based on meteorological drivers from today and information about the system passed on from yesterday. And I'll note that this model is pre-trained in the way that I described earlier. When we assimilate observations into the model, we are updating the temperature predictions and cell states of the LSTM model with an ensemble Kalman filter to adjust for any errors in the model, which then get used to improve predictions at the next time step. From a practical perspective, this is sort of what the modeling framework and inputs and outputs looks like. Each day, our pipeline is retrieving and processing weather forecasts from NOAA product. And we're also going and fetching observed reservoir releases and observed water temperatures from yesterday. And forecasts are made for today, day 0, because we haven't observed today's maximum temperature yet when we need to issue the forecast, and then forecasting 7 days out into the future. From 3,100 ensembles that are generated using the guest ensembles and dropouts, we're able to produce an estimate of water temperature forecast, but also produce those confidence intervals as well for 5 relevant sites in the basin. And then, of course, we need to take this information and translate it into something that is useful and digestible for the reservoir operator. And so I wanted to just show you what this looks like, because it might look very different than what we might say publish in an academic publication. So this output was co-designed between us and the reservoir operator and contains the information that they need. In this case, they needed the forecast with confidence intervals at these 5 sites. But they also wanted that forecast translated into the probability of exceeding 75 degrees, because that is the most relevant piece of information to the decision that they're making. We also report reliability and accuracy so that the operator can determine whether these forecasts are useful to them. Can they trust it, and is it accurate enough to inform their decisions? Notice we're providing lots of information here on the request of the reservoir operator. We're looking 10 days in the past. So how is the model performing recently? And then how has it done historically over the duration of the forecast? This is actually a real forecast that was issued yesterday. So how are the models performing? Overall, the deep learning model with data assimilation is performing well. We're able to maintain below 2 degrees RMSE for 7 days into the future. And we have about a 1.2 RMSE on 1 day into the future. I'm showing you the persistence forecast in purple here, which is sort of the easiest model, which is just taking the temperature from yesterday and propagating it forward. The deep learning model in orange is using yesterday's temperature as a predictor, as a driver, and then DA is assimilating information. You can see that there are marginal gains from the data assimilation approach, but it is helping us generally on day 0 and day 1. And then I just wanted to show you that there is variability across these 5 sites of how well the models are performing. The most decision relevant site is this Lordsville site in green. And I'll note that the hardest site, the site that's performing the worst, is below the Never Sink reservoir, which we have yet to model and include a new pre-trainer for. So one hypothesis is that once we include that new pre-trainer, we can improve performance. Of course, reducing those predictions down to an RMSE or a bias estimate is sort of covering up some of the nuance that we see in the data. One thing that we've noticed is that we are over predicting when there are large rain events, which I've highlighted here. And we think this is because we've had to remove precipitation from the drivers of the model, because when we were developing the model, it was actually making predictions worse. So the model currently has no way to distinguish between flows from reservoir releases and sort of flows that might be generated by precipitation events. So we're hopeful that once we get some new driver data in there, that will help improve forecasts at some of these sites. So I want to end on a few lessons that we've learned from taking PGDL methods that have been developed between us and our academic collaborators to delivering predictions for real-time decision-making. First, I'll say that the specifics of the decision are really important and can constrain your modeling efforts. When we learned that we needed to issue the forecast at 11 a.m., all of a sudden we lost some performance because we could only look at yesterday's maximum temperature and not today. So really understanding your decision landscape and what they want out of that decision can be really important, and can be helped through co-design of these products with your stakeholder early on. Another lesson we learned is that we needed to train the model up to the forecasting period. And sometimes that can be difficult to do because it's hard to track down all of the driver data up to your forecast period. So for example, it was difficult to get together all of the reservoir release data because those aren't easy to get from the reservoir operators. So that might be something that slows you down in getting a forecast up and running. And finally, traditional model outputs or evaluation metrics may not be the most relevant thing to the decision maker. One thing we're really excited about is looking backwards over this first summer of forecasting that we did and ask questions like, how well did we anticipate exceedance events? Our next steps for these forecasting efforts, we rapidly kind of deployed this forecasting effort. So we have a lot of model development that we still want to do. Like I mentioned, we want to expand our drivers into flow and or precip. We want to do uncertainty quantification. We also recognize that we're leaving some information on the table. We're leaving 10 hours of temperature data in the morning on the table, and we're wondering how much we can improve our predictions by understanding, say, the minimum that occurs in that time period. Maybe we have to do sub-daily predictions, we don't know. I also left out that we're actually not using the graph network for these predictions because we're just doing 5 individual sites, but we're interested in spatially expanding and going back to that graph convolution network. And finally, we want to make these forecasts public and useful to more than just the reservoir operator who we're sharing them with privately right now. And so hopefully in the near future, you'll be able to find them on this Office of the Delaware River Master webpage that I'm showing here. And thank you, that's all I have.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. We need to move on to our next speaker, but if you're able to answer questions by text in Slido, then a few questions can get some answers. So next up is Janet Barclay, also the United States Geological Survey. Her talk is titled, Remember Where You Are, Teaching a Stream Temperature Model to Embrace Long-Term Groundwater Exchange Patterns. And we see your slides, Janet.
Great, and do you see the video?
That too, yeah.
Awesome, great. Yeah, so as Allison mentioned, I am a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and most of my recent work has been in simulating and observing groundwater surface water exchange patterns. I'm actually relatively very new to deep learning, and so this is sort of the first project, and in the part of the focus of this project is really bringing those long-term patterns of groundwater discharge into and using those as process guidance for stream temperature predictions. As with many projects, actually every project, there's been a number of folks who are involved with this. So these are some of the folks that have contributed code and really significantly to the work on the project, and some others who have contributed ideas and reviews and things. This work is part of the ExaSheds project, which is a US Department of Energy funded project that involves multiple of the national labs, as well as USGS and the University of Texas at Austin. Groundwater discharge is an important driver of water temperature in many ecosystems. In these images, we're looking at stream bank groundwater seep. And so in this top one, we have the stream bank up here on the top left and the river channel here on the bottom right. The water line crosses kind of right diagonally across here, and you can see some sediment being actually washed into the stream from that seep. The bottom picture is a thermal infrared video, and in this image, cool colors indicate cooler temperatures and warmer colors indicate warmer temperatures. And so here we can see the cold groundwater entering that stream and mixing with the stream water and cooling it locally. In most instances, groundwater has a moderating effect on the stream temperature, warming it in the colder winter and cooling it in the warm summer. And this creates critical habitat for temperature-sensitive species. Despite the importance of groundwater discharge to stream temperatures, many temperature models do not explicitly incorporate groundwater discharge. Lack of this explicit representation can result in a couple of problems. So at least a couple of problems. So first, emitting groundwater discharge dynamics likely results in temperature predictions that are less accurate, particularly in areas with heterogeneous groundwater discharge. And these errors might be expected to become greater for predictions under future climate conditions for some reasons that I'll discuss in a few minutes. But then second, even if the predicted temperatures are relatively accurate, resource managers are hesitant to base decisions on a model that lacks a groundwater component because they know that groundwater is an important driver of stream temperatures. Like I mentioned, emitting groundwater discharge might be particularly problematic for predictions under future climate conditions. Hare et al. Analyzed long-term temperature trends in streams and rivers across the contiguous US. The sites they used are mapped in the top of this figure, and they classified each site as being influenced by atmospheric, deep groundwater, or shallow groundwater temperature drivers. The lower part of the figure shows the proportion of sites in each group. Those are the panels, the groups are the panel columns are the different groups, with temperature trends during both annual and summer periods. And so the time period of the trends is the two rows of panels. Warming trends are shown in orange, cooling trends in blue, and stable trends are in gray. And so the center column of panels, these two here, are the shallow groundwater sites. And the right column is that these two here are the deep groundwater sites. And if we look at the height of the orange bars, they found substantially more warming trends in streams that had a shallow groundwater influence, that's the center column, than in deep water groundwater influence, that's the right-hand column. And this means that to accurately predict stream temperatures in the future, we'll need to provide information not only about the extent of groundwater influence, but also whether that groundwater is deep or shallow. So we can use the multi-year time series of temperatures to identify the primary driver of those temperature patterns. At multi-annual timescales, air temperatures and water temperatures can be approximated by sinusoidal functions. And the properties of these functions are indicative of the major processes driving the stream temperatures. In streams where the primary temperature driver is atmospheric conditions, the water temperature sinusoid will be similar to the air temperature signal in both phase and amplitude. The temperature of deep groundwater varies little throughout the year. And so when deep groundwater is the primary driver of stream temperatures, the amplitude of the water temperature signal will be substantially dampened, but the phase will not be shifted relative to the atmospheric signal. And this is because all the temperature variation is coming from that atmospheric signal, even though it isn't necessarily the primary driver in the system. Unlike deep groundwater, the temperature of shallow groundwater varies seasonally, but the amplitude is dampened and the phase is shifted relative to the atmospheric signal. This means that the shallow groundwater warms later and cools later than the air temperature. And so a reduced amplitude and a phase shift in the water temperatures relative to the air temperatures are indicative of the influence of shallow groundwater. And so we can make these determinations of atmospheric shallow groundwater or deep groundwater based on multi-year time series of observed temperatures. And so we take the observed temperatures and we fit them to a sinusoidal curve, and then we can take those coefficients to calculate the amplitude and the phase. And then the final step in terms of looking at the stream temperature drivers is to calculate the difference in the ratio of the amplitudes and the difference in phase. Here we're looking at the amplitude ratio on the y-axis plotted versus the phase shift on the x-axis, both calculated using observed temperatures for sites across the contiguous US. And these are the sites that were analyzed by Hare et al. And so on the x-axis, we have that phase shift with temperature sites that are plotting to the left are places where the water temperature responds quickly to changes in air temperature. And points that are plotting at the right respond more slowly. On the y-axis is that amplitude ratio with points at the top having a large amplitude relative to the air temperature, and points at the bottom are places where the stream temperature has a relatively small annual amplitude relative to the air temperature. Work at sites across the contiguous US has suggested some thresholds, 10 days and an amplitude ratio of 0.65 for categorizing sites by their primary driver. And so we can identify these sites or classify them as being atmospherically driven, shallow groundwater driven, or deep groundwater driven. And now there's a lot of spread across this data, but these can work as primary categories. And so then we can use these temperature signal properties, the amplitude ratio and the phase shift, and these resulting classifications as both sources of process guidance in our deep learning models and to evaluate those models. So our group has been developing models to predict stream temperature in the Delaware River Basin, and you've heard some of that from Sam just a minute ago, using some various process-guided deep learning methods. One of the current approaches is a recurrent graph convolutional network that's pre-trained on a process model of stream temperature. And the version I'm using here simultaneously predicts stream discharge and stream temperature. So this figure is showing the root mean squared errors on the y-axis for predictions by driver classification. So the sites are on the x-axis by those classifications. And so on the, so we have the, so on the y-axis, we have the reach level root mean squared error, and then we have the classifications from this, the signal analysis with atmospheric on the left in red, deep groundwater in blue in the center, and shallow groundwater on the right. And we see that the root mean squared error is higher for the deep groundwater sites relative to the atmospheric sites, and also is higher for that one shallow groundwater site. The existing models also poorly predict the observed temperature properties, both amplitude ratio and the phase shift. And so here we have the predicted values on the y-axis and the observed values on the x-axis, and none of them are really plotted along that one-to-one line. There's a lot of scatter. And so these together suggest that these existing stream temperature models may have lower accuracy at sites with greater groundwater influence, and highlight the importance of explicitly incorporating groundwater discharge into our stream temperature predictions. And so that's the basic objective of this project, is to explicitly incorporate that groundwater guidance, and to do that by the development of a custom loss function that takes advantage of those annual signal properties. The study area for this work is the Delaware River Basin that you heard a little bit about from Sam. It covers 4 states in the northeastern US and is a major source of water supply for 16 million people. And as Sam mentioned, it's also habitat for some temperature sensitive species, in particular the brook trout and dwarf wedge mussels. And this is a map of the river network in the Delaware, and the thicker plotted streams in red, blue, and green are those where we have enough temperature data where we can classify them based on the primary temperature driver. So the stream temperature model that I'm working from was developed by Xiaowei Jia and is currently being maintained by Jeff Sadler. As I mentioned, it uses a recurrent graph convolution network, and it has an adjacency matrix to represent the stream network's graph structure. And this model simultaneously predicts stream temperature and stream flow. The model is being run we're using data from 1980 through 2016 as the results I'm presenting today. The model is trained in 2 phases. We have a pre-training phase and a fine-tuning phase. In the pre-training phase, the model is trained to outputs from SNTemp, which is a process-based model that simulates daily stream temperatures using outputs from the precipitation runoff modeling system. And the benefit of this is that data from SNTemp are abundant. We have a temperature for every reach every day, which provides ample information for the model to establish the coarse scale temperature patterns. And then in the fine-tuning phase, the model is further refined using the observed temperatures. In this project, we're using the temperature signal properties, the amplitude ratio and the phase difference from the observed temperatures as targets, as additional targets in the fine-tuning phase. And so at each step of the fine-tuning, the amplitude ratio and the phase shift of the current predictions are calculated and compared with the observed values using the root mean squared error. And we have hyperparameters to scale both of those contributions to the loss function. There's multiple ways to extract the temperature signal properties. When we are calculating the observed values, we started with the simplest, the linear regression that I described earlier. Initially, as we calculated it in the loss function, we were using the matrix solution of the linear regression. And that approach worked, but was computationally very intensive because of needing to take the inverse of many large matrices. And so recently we started implementing a signal processing approach, and this work has very much been driven by Simon Top, which uses a Fourier fast transform to quantify the amplitudes and the phase differences. And this approach has reduced the training times by a factor of about 10. And so what we're looking at here is the change in root mean squared error, that's the y-axis, when we implemented the groundwater loss function for those three groups. So we have the atmospheric sites on the left in red, the deep groundwater sites in blue in the center, and the one shallow groundwater site on the right. That dashed gray line is the zero change. And so things that plot above that line are places where the groundwater loss function reduced the model performance, and sites that are plotting below that line are places where the groundwater loss function improved the performance. And so what we see is that adding the groundwater loss terms reduced the root mean squared error in most reaches with groundwater influence, whether that was deep or shallow. If we look at the predicted and observed amplitude ratios with and without the loss function, so on the left, we have the predicted versus observed amplitude ratio with the loss function, and on the right, we have the predicted and observed amplitude ratio without the loss function, the groundwater loss function. And looking at those, we see a slightly better fit of the amplitude ratio with the loss function, although we do see that the amplitude ratio is slightly under predicted still. These results are preliminary and the sample size is small, but they do suggest that incorporating the annual properties into the loss function may improve the stream temperature predictions in streams with groundwater influenced temperature regimes. And so some of the things we're looking at as we go forward, where you have some things that we're looking at to refine these methods. And the first one is to expand the number of sites where we have observed temperature signal properties. One of those things, as I mentioned, the current scope of data, it goes up until, in this model, it goes up until 2016. We have driver and observed temperature data up through 2020, so we'll be incorporating that into the model soon. And also many water temperature sensors are not deployed year round. They're left out from spring through late fall because of the interest is predominantly in high temperatures during the late summer. And so we're going to be looking at some different methods where we can estimate these annual properties using less than annual temperature series. And then we'll also be looking into fine-tuning those hyperparameters. There's also some really important science questions that we're thinking about. We're thinking about what can we learn both from a modeling and a process perspective about reaches where this loss function does or doesn't improve the predictions. We're also asking some questions about how can we couple this with a numerical groundwater model, and can we use that to further improve the predictions. And so in summary, we see that existing KGML stream temperature models do not explicitly incorporate groundwater discharge. We see that the predictive errors are higher at sites with groundwater temperature signals. And we also see that groundwater process information can be extracted from these annual temperature signals, and that we can use it in model training to improve the temperature predictions in some of these groundwater dominated reaches. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thanks, Janet. We do have a couple of minutes. Start with a question from Charu. Are you able to include nearby groundwater data directly into the LSTM as an input feature?
So we could add that in. We've tossed around, how best to incorporate groundwater discharge information? Do we put it in this loss function that's based on those annual temperature signals? Or do we add it as additional input factors or input data? I think we would need to, yeah, so that's definitely something that we're considering. We haven't done it yet. It would probably need to be output from a groundwater flow model, which is definitely available for this area. So.
Thanks, and I think we can do one more. Groundwater is also important for nutrient and carbon fluxes. Can your techniques be used to inform those fluxes?
Yeah, so I think that would be really interesting to see. I mean, right now I'm working on modeling temperature, so I haven't tried, putting it into modeling those nutrient fluxes. But I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I think that if we do get the groundwater discharge modeling right, then yeah, it should definitely have implications and be able to be sort of ported into models of other things that are dependent on groundwater discharge.
Great. Thank you, Janet, and thank you to all of our speakers from this first half of the session. We have a 10-minute break coming up, so until the top of the hour, it'll be 3 Central. Enjoy your break, and we'll see you all back in a few. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We have 3 more talks in the rest of this Aquatic Sciences session. And then in 1 hour after those talks, we have a 25-minute Aquatic Sciences facilitated discussion. So I hope you'll stick with us through all the way through the end of that discussion. Right now, we have Jenna Robinson and Marcia Corver. Jenna's with the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and Marcia's with McGill University. And they're speaking about Lake Expedition 2020, a virtual collaboration of early career researchers integrating machine learning and aquatic sciences. Take it away.
Thank you, Allison. I'll share the screen. All right. There we go. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Marcia Corver, and so today I will, together with Jenna Robinson, talk on behalf of the Lake Expedition Research Group about our collaborative research. We are a group of mostly early career researchers from across the world, and we have been coming together virtually for about a year now to work on an interdisciplinary project that integrates the aquatic and computer sciences through knowledge-guided machine learning. In this talk, however, we will not focus on the research details, but talk about an important aspect of interdisciplinary and collaborative research. And that is the science of team science, which is here illustrated as the boat that keeps the team together during research. So in the spirit of team science, this talk will also be collaborative. So I will first introduce the team, our objectives, and the importance of team science, and then I will hand it over to Jenna.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Robinson. Like Marcia mentioned, I'm also part of the Lake Expedition Group. And after Marcia introduces our team and objectives, I'll jump in and discuss good management practices for research teams. I will reflect on what our team has learned so far, and hopefully I can engage you in a discussion with a poll on Slido about your own experiences in research teams based on what Marcia and I have talked to you about. And with that, I'll hand it back to Marcia.
All right, great. So the Lake Expedition Program is established by the Global Lake Ecological Network, or GLEON in short, and it receives support from the National Science Foundation. It's a team science program for graduate students, which means that we learn about effective collaboration practices in a large, diverse, and international team of researchers. And we all have different backgrounds and various expertise. So this program is really in line with some of the core values of GLEON, evolving around interdisciplinarity, collegiality, collaboration, inclusion, and diversity, and to share ideas, expertise, and data. So why are we doing this? On this slide, you see a figure from an article by Vukti, Jones, and Uzi, who showed that science and the generation of knowledge is more and more performed in teams, rather than traditionally by one solo author. So both the number of publications with team authorship and the size of these teams have been growing in the sciences. And it's also been shown that outcomes generated by teams surpass individual accomplishments. So team science is really the future. But at the same time, there's very little training in our education system on how to effectively work in teams, especially when these teams consist of members with different backgrounds and expertise. The way that our training program is set up is that we first actively learn about team management and collaborative skills through workshops. And then we apply this knowledge in practice by collaborating on a research project for which we develop the necessary technical skills. And we also create products in the form of publications and outreach events like presentations. And so the main technical skill that we are learning, the main skills that we are learning are all centered around machine learning. So this training program has been in place since 2012, and so far 3 cohorts of students have completed it, each of them focusing on different research topics that were all of their own choice. And this has resulted in several publications and products on topics ranging from how to do team science to water quality modeling or developing ecological apps. So this is the current cohort that started about a year ago. So what I want to highlight is that we are a highly diverse team, connected through a law for the aquatic sciences, that is. But what I mean by a diverse team is not just in the sense of identity, like gender or ethnicity, but also through a mix of career stages, expertise, and backgrounds. For example, we have both early career and experienced researchers. We have people with a background in ecology, hydrology, computer, and also social science. People that do field-based research and modelers, and researchers that work from like local to global skills. So this diversity means that we all bring our unique views and philosophies to the group. And that's illustrated here by all the different ways that you could perceive this symbol. Like you could see it as an 8 or an infinity symbol or a molecule, etc. So team diversity is really key to booking positive research outcomes. Here I show a diagram from an article by Cervello and others that showed really nicely how in a setting of ecological collaboration, how team member diversity has a direct effect on overall team functioning and communication, and how that is in turn very important to book positive research outcomes. So the goal of our research project is to assess patterns of change in lake and reservoir area of about 100,000 water bodies in the US. So this is a research objective that we developed ourselves through a few brainstorming sessions, but partly driven by a shared wish of the group to learn about machine learning technologies. The aim is to build a machine learning model that can, on the one hand, fill time series data gaps, and on the other hand, identify clusters of lakes that share similar patterns of aerial change over time. So here you see a first preliminary result of one of our model runs. But for specifics on this project, I would like to invite you to check out the poster that we created for this conference. And it's being presented by our cohort member, Heather Wander. So to close off my introduction, I would just like to add that the theme of this conference, knowledge-guided machine learning, lends itself specifically well for team science, as it consists for the first part of knowledge-guided, which in our group represents the limnologists, the hydrologists, the ecologists, and for the second part of machine learning, which represents the people with technical skills and experience in more computer sciences. So there's a constant interaction between like the domain knowledge that informs the technical machine learning models. To give a really simple example, like our data analysis informed us that the data gaps of our data set were centered in the north of the US and mainly during wintertime. And then our domain knowledge explained this by winter lake ice cover. And then on its turn, we can use this to inform the machine learning model when it will fill in the data gaps. So but the real topic and the question of this presentation is, how do we make sure that this part, so the communication and the collaboration, between these two groups is effective and also pleasant. So I'll hand over the stage to Jenna to dive into this and tell us about good management practices of teams.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So like Marcia mentioned, about 1 year ago, our team came together and met for the very first time. And many times when a research team is forming, you tend to focus on the technical skills that each individual can contribute to the group. But focusing on team relationships and communication early on is crucial for maintaining good team management practices. When we first met, with training from the great community sociologist Jenny Cross, our team prioritized and learned how to build relationships, communicate with each other, and how to set up a framework that has allowed our team to share leadership roles and evolve through time. But transdisciplinary science does require more than just interpersonal skills. Let me go to the next slide. A good team also needs balance in the technical domain. If you've ever worked in a team and felt frustrated or confused about the details of the project or your role in the group, it's likely that your team is out of balance and this web of technical and interpersonal skills might be a little bit out of whack. And like any machine learning problem, if you're not getting the results you need, you have to change your inputs to your model. And our group realized that we needed additional skill sets to answer the research questions that we had designed. So we brought in new team members to our collaboration and brought back this balance that we needed to maintain efficiency in our research. A paper published this year focusing on macrosystem science specified that interdisciplinary teams require a distinct set of skills to carry out successful group projects. This includes systems thinkers. Every team should have at least one of these systems thinkers. They're the type of person that can evaluate interactions and relationships within the team. You also need to have good skilled communicators who can communicate with understanding and clarity to the team and to members outside of the team. And you also need to have domain experts that have deep knowledge and expertise within the field. And among these and a few other skill sets, these types of participants have been shown to be crucial for not only project efficiency, but also for improving career readiness and high impact science. However, with all these skill sets in one group, you inherently have a lot of diversity on your team, which can also bring some challenges. And in order to benefit from this diversity and utilize the creative opportunities that can come with it, it's helpful to understand the conditions for creativity and therefore the high impact science that it can bring. So when your team first sits down and starts to plan out a research project, you may fall into this realm of divergent thinking. You have many ideas that you can focus your research project on. What's new, what's novel, what research questions do you want to answer? This step is necessary in the early stages of a project and ultimately leads to innovation, but good communication can be hard if one team member wants to go one direction while you want to go another. And eventually you do want to transition into this realm of convergent thinking. What are the specific questions you want to answer or the hypotheses that you want to test? This is a comfortable place to be in when you find the direction you want to take your project. But getting to this point, it can be tricky. There's no clear path between innovative divergent thinking, and ultimately getting to that decision point and converging in on a single idea. And this area in between these two realms has been coined the ground zone. And our team has felt the full force of this zone numerous times. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to this. But acknowledging the fact that the ground zone is part of the creative process allows you to tap into the skills necessary to make your way through it. When you're in the ground zone, you may feel like you're not moving forward, that you might have an uneven distribution of tasks. And in today's world, that meeting virtually might make it difficult to stay engaged and efficient. But through the awareness of the ground zone, you can create the space necessary to plan and evolve. You might have to generate action plans and set expectations that can be changed through time. You may decide to facilitate and delegate tasks, to listen to each other, and to reflect on your experiences. Our team found that actually putting an abstract together for this conference helped us move through the ground zone. And in addition to this, we also, leading up to this conference, we decided to do a team reflection where we anonymously thought about the things that we are good at and the things that we need to work on so far over the course of the year that we've been together. And we found that our team has really great cohesion. We have good team evolution, enthusiasm, communication, respect for each other, and a feeling of responsibility for our team. But we also learned that we need to work on balancing our other priorities with this research project, that we need to delegate tasks and clarify expectations to move through the ground zone, and that we need to work on maintaining individual involvement. And through this reflective process that we went through, we learned that you need to balance teamwork and task work to maintain team efficiency. And through this reflection, we created the space necessary to address this imbalance and move forward and get through that ground zone. And so after talking about all of this, I want to ask you all a question. I'm sure there are many experts in the audience here, both in machine learning and beyond. And I want to ask you, have you ever been a part of a research team as an expert in your field? And if so, based on what Marcia and I have talked about, what have your teams done well with, and what do you wish could be improved upon? I put a poll in Slido, and it's just multiple choice. And I was wondering if you would be willing to go in and select the qualities that you feel your research teams have done well with, and then don't select the qualities that you feel like you may have needed to work on in your team. And then if we have some time, we can discuss this at the end or in the discussion in a little while. And yes, thank you, everybody.
That's fun doing that poll. I'm really looking forward to seeing what people come up with. I guess while we're waiting for that, can I ask a question? Let's see. So a critical question for a few students in the audience could be, when is the next cohort and how can students join?
That's a great question. I think there's usually a few years in between each cohort. I'm not sure if this depends on funding or Paul and Kathy's availability. But if you go to the GLEON website, gleon.org, you can find information about how to apply to the fellowship.
Thanks. One other question. Are there any issues in working on a long-term project with people you've never met in person?
Yeah, I think that with any project, when you are first meeting people, you might be hesitant to fully engage, or might not be aware of everyone's skill sets. And I think that's really why it's so important to build these relationships early on so that you can move through that phase and get to know each other better.
Maybe I'll just add one thing to that. So it was all virtual, and it's definitely a challenge, but we did do an effort, even though it was virtual, to do some like socializing activities, and they actually really helped. And that's something I would really recommend to any group that starts out like that. It might feel a bit awkward in the beginning, but it will pay out, even if it's virtual.
Thanks. Sounds like great advice. It's time for us to move on to our next speaker, and hopefully we can come back to this poll in the discussion. So our next speaker is Moritz Feigl, who is with the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria. His talk title is Learning from Mistakes, Assessing the Performance and Uncertainty in Process-Based Models.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yep, there they are.
Okay. Hi, and good evening from Vienna. My name is Moritz, and I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Hydrology and Water Management at the BOKU in Vienna. And the work I'm presenting today is what I started while I still was a visiting researcher at the University of Calgary in the group of Masaki Hayashi. And the topic is learning from mistakes, assessing the performance and uncertainty in process-based models. Process-based models are mathematical representations of physical processes and are based on detailed measurements and often also some kind of parameter estimation. However, even after setting up such a model and having it based on extensive knowledge and a lot of data, model errors still exist. And with model errors, I mean the difference between observations and simulations, often called model residuals. And if those model errors are not random, there are three general reasons for them to occur. First, they can be due to simplified or misrepresented processes. Second, they can be due to missing processes, but it can also be due to measurement errors. And all of these errors have the potential to either lead to biased conclusion when you use the model, or they can also be negligible for the application of the model. And the point is, we don't know. And this brings us to our research question, is to develop an objective methods to analyze model errors of process-based models to gain further insight and enhance trust in the applied model. And for that, we developed a workflow we called learning from mistakes. And as you see here in this flow chart, it consists of 7 steps. And the upper row can be summarized as the process-based model application. And the lower row is the error analysis. And it starts with using variables, observed variables, as input for our process-based model, which we use to simulate our system. And with that, we can compute model errors, so a time series of model errors. And here comes the main idea of this workflow. If we are able to predict these model errors from available data, then we can assess the relationship between input variables and model errors to gain further insight into the error process relationships. And for that, we use a machine learning model to predict model errors based on available variables. And this includes the inputs to the process-based model, but as well as any other kind of variable we have available. And I want to go a bit more into detail for these 2 next steps. So when you apply machine learning for predicting model errors, this is of course, so the choice of machine learning model is depending on the type of error structure we have and the type of models, or if it's like maps or time series. But usually any type of time series prediction model, or if you need some maps of errors, CNN work just fine. And then we can use this trained model to produce local explanations. And local explanations is a term coming from explainable machine learning. And it refers to the contribution of input variables to a prediction. And here in this example, you see the black box is depicting a machine learning model. And on the left side, we have 4 inputs for one specific data point. And at the lower end, we have the resulting prediction of 0.8. And the local explanations are what you see here in the middle, which reflect the contribution of each of these values to the prediction. And of course, this is not how our model works internally, but it's a post-processing method that allows us to explain the model and specifically this one prediction. And to compute local explanations, we use Shapley additive explanations, or short SHAP values, by Lundberg and Lee in 2017. And we chose this method since it can be applied to any model. It's based on game theory and therefore on solid theoretical foundation. So therefore, when I talk about SHAP values or local explanations, I use them as a synonym of each other for the rest of the talk. And of course, we can also plot those not for one prediction, but for time series of predictions. So here we see in the black line the predicted errors of a model, and the colored stacked bar charts are the local explanations for each prediction. And with that, we already have a lot of information which we can further explore to find out how these errors are related to processes. But one thing that you might have noticed, and it's really something that also was mentioned in talks before. Whenever you apply explainability methods for machine learning, especially in geoscience, you have to deal with input variable correlation. Because if we have variable correlations, variable dependency, it results in no stable prediction, variable relationships, and also maybe biased local explanations. So to solve this problem, we use not the raw data, but principal components of data, and also further developed methods, which we call PCA shape values. And so that means we take our inputs, use a PCA transformation, and then train a machine learning model. And since principal components of data are per definition linearly uncorrelated, correlation will not affect the machine learning model. And then we use PCA shape to compute shape values for the original variables. And just briefly, here in this flow graph, you see how this is computed. The basic idea is after computing principal components, you know, for each principal component, the loading for each variable. And then after training the machine learning model, we get shape values for each principal component, and then can recalculate shape values for the original variables using the loadings of the PCA. And with that, we can move on to the last part of the learning from mistakes workflow, which is clustering. Since this type of representation is really interesting, but it's so complex that it's hard to interpret. Therefore, we apply clustering to get error clusters, which we can then interpret. And so we use those PCA shape values as input for a cluster analysis. And since clustering can potentially be quite subjective, we apply multiple algorithms and multiple numbers of clusters and just choose the best combination by a cluster separation measure. So we use silhouette values. And then we can derive stable cluster of error variable relationships. And then looking at these variables that are important for a specific cluster, we can come up with conclusion which processes might be related to that error. And to show you a bit how this can be done, I will go on with a case study. And this is a case study we did in the Rocky Mountains, a stream temperature modeling of a subalpine headwater stream. And the study site is located west of Calgary, so in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. It's a small stream, and the aim of this case study was to apply a process-based model to this stream and model the first 850 meters. And we had available water temperature measurements, stream water temperature measurements along the stream, discharge measurements, and also meteorological data from a meteorological station just located next to the stream. And for process-based modeling, we used H-Flux, a stream water temperature model, which is one-dimensional based on finite difference method, and it solves the mass and energy balance equations. And here below, you see all the energy fluxes that are represented in H-Flux, and we run the model with a 1 minute time step, a 1 meter distance step, and we had data starting from August 8 until August 26 in 2019. And the available data we had for our error model came mainly from the weather station located next to the stream, but also we had discharge measurements, and we had the variables relative humidity, discharge, long wave radiation, wind speed, short wave radiation, air temperature, and canopy temperature. And what you already see here is that some of these variables, this is a correlation matrix, some of these variables are highly correlated, and that's showing the importance of correcting for this correlation. Otherwise, the relationship between errors and input variables will not be stable. And we applied XGBoost model for our error modeling. And we had roughly 1,700 data points, which are 50-minute time steps of all the hydrological, meteorological variables. And we applied some pre-processing, so mainly we transformed the hours of the day into continuous variables. And we also used lags of data for all other variables. So 8 lags means 2 hours. And the model tuning consists of using 5 random days for testing, cross-validation, and a Bayesian hyperparameter optimization. And when applying this model to predict model errors, we see the results here. So this is the stream temperature, and in blue, you see the observations. In orange, you see the process-based model predictions. And in green, you see the process-based model plus the error model predictions. And you see that most of the errors are pretty well met. And this is also reflected in the RMSE, which is reduced from 0.378 to 0.145. And with these results, we see that there must be some valuable information contained in the variables, as we can predict most of the errors of this process-based model. So therefore, we're going ahead and have a look at the PCA shape values and the error clusters. And this is the graph for the first 2 days of the time period. And we see here is residuals and PCA shape values, and the lines show the predicted residuals. And in gray, we see the process-based model residuals, the original ones. And the stacked bars colored are the PCA shape values of the variables. And in the back, you see colored the error clusters, which we found. And I want to briefly talk about the cluster 3 errors, which mainly occur during starting at noon until the end, late afternoon, and are mainly underestimation and times of large errors. And when we look at the characteristics of cluster 3 errors, we see something like this. So on the left side here, we see the observed values during cluster 3 errors, so all the variables. And we see that there's medium to a high shortwave radiation, high air temperature, high canopy temperature, and lower wind speed and relative humidity. And here on this spider plot, we see the median PCA shape values for all variables, showing which variables are mainly used for predicting these errors. And we see the most important ones are canopy temperature, shortwave radiation, air temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed. And from this and further looking into the time series plots, we came up with the hypothesis for this error cluster, which is that errors of cluster 3 are related to uncertainties in shading. And we came to this conclusion since we know that H-flux assumes constant shading over time. However, this is not the case in this catchment. So the sun shines along the stream at around 2:30 p.m., which means there is no shading during that time. And this hypothesis, we added 2-point shading to H-flux. So therefore, we just used the original shading values and linearly decreased them starting at noon until 2:30 p.m. when they reach 0, and then linearly increase them again until 5 p.m. And after implementing that in the model, so there's no calibration, just slight change of how shading is used, from the results here shown in green, we immediately see that the predicted values for the peaks in stream temperature definitely improved. Of course, it's far from perfect since it's just a rough estimate, but it shows the point and gives evidence to our hypothesis. So in summary, model errors contain valuable information. And the learning from mistakes workflow uses this information to provide evidence for error process relationships. However, interpretation is still difficult and needs expert knowledge. You need to know about the model, about the system. But the good thing is the LFM workflow can be used for any type of process-based model and is not affected by input correlation. And it's also important to point out that how you use this workflow really depends on your application. So if you're a model developer, you will need this information about errors to improve your model or see which processes maybe are not perfect in the model. And if you're just using it maybe for a decision-making process, it might be interesting to see where the errors are coming from, so you know that your decision is not biased through because of some model errors. Thank you so much, and that's it.
Thank you, Margaret. It's really inspiring to see you get to take this interpretation all the way back to changing the model. We have a few questions in Slido. One of them, let's see. So how do you measure the feature's importance after you've mapped the original feature from high to low dimension space using PCA?
So I can just quickly answer this with this small flow graph. Or here, I have it. So what we do is, so we use the principal components as the input for the machine learning model. And so when we compute like the original shape values with that machine learning models, we have shape values for each principal component. And since we know that loading of a principal component with standardized variables is something like, or it's actually the correlation between this principal component and this one specific variable, we could just use this again to weight the principal component shape values again to get shape values for the original variables. I hope this answers the question. Might be a bit difficult to understand if you haven't worked with shape values before. But it's more or less a post-processing of shape values when using principal components as inputs.
Yeah, thanks. That did help me with that. Could you explain again how you identified shading as the key source of error? The shape seemed to me that everything mattered.
Yeah, and of course, I did not tell you the whole truth actually, since so we saw that of course it's hard to see from this plot because we further looked also at the time series plots for these errors, and we noticed they're just during times of high shortwave radiation. But there's also a second process which is kind of reflecting, which is reflected here in the PCA shape values. It's canopy temperature and air temperature. So additionally to the shortwave radiation input, which is hard to see here, but more clearly visible when you look at the time series, we also have some error coming from tree emitted long wave radiation, which is why air temperature and canopy temperature is so important for predicting this, because the H-flux model just uses air temperature to predict the tree emittent long wave radiation, but actually those times it's always it's always during times of very high stream temperature and even much higher canopy temperature. So there's just these two effects as well. And everything becomes much more clear if you see the time series as well, but I just couldn't fit those in the presentation. I hope this answers your question. Maybe you brought more questions.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we have time for one more. If you use this framework for multiple catchments, do you think you would see similar error structures and attribute those to similar inputs?
Potentially. I think it really depends on if you calibrate the model for the whole area or for a single catchment differently. Because I think it's important to understand that here we assume that the model is fully calibrated and it's ready for being applied for decision making or whatever you want to use it for. And if there are like changes in the parameter, of course, this error relationship would change. But I think if you apply the same model, so parameterize for the whole area, then it should be possible to get a more universal answer from that.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we have one last talk that's going to be from Anush Karpatny of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. He'll be talking about biology-guided neural networks, integrating biological knowledge with neural networks for discovering phenotypic traits from fish images.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, your slides look good too.
All right, perfect. All right, thank you so much for inviting me to this session. This is a very exciting workshop. My name is Anuj Patni. I'm an assistant professor in computer science at Virginia Tech. And today I'll be talking about a very recent line of work that we're exploring in this rich world of KGML research, which is building a new class of biology-guided neural networks. So in this workshop, we have had so many great talks discussing several types of scientific knowledge that is being ingested in machine learning frameworks. We have process-based simulation models. We have partial differential equations that have been discussed. And a lot of talks have focused on time series data. This talk would take a complementary perspective, adding to the diversity of KGML research by talking about image data and how we can leverage scientific knowledge available in a very different form, in the form of knowledge graphs, ontologies, and phylogenies that we have available in biological sciences to improve the generalizability, robustness to adversarial attacks, even in the paucity of labeled data. So this is connected to Aquatic Sciences because the focus of this work on building biology-guided neural networks, or BGNNs, is to understand and study fish images better. So we are interested in studying teleost fishes. And in my talk, I'll talk about the high-level objectives that we are exploring here. My objective would be to see similar ideas being explored in other problems of aquatic sciences. Yeah, okay, I got my mouse pointer back. Okay, so let me first introduce you to the team behind the BGNN work. This is a collaborative project with 5 PIs and more than 5 institutions that are coming together. This work is funded as part of the HDR Ideas Lab activity. So all of this work started in 2019. Thanks to NSF, we all came together as part of a week-long activity from very different disciplines, where we thought about a really interesting scientific problem that we could solve by harnessing the data. In this case, we looked at harnessing image data and how we can leverage existing scientific knowledge for this problem in the spirit of KGML research. So this has led to a very interesting project. We are learning a lot from collaborating with biologists and computer scientists in our team. And I'll talk about some of the research highlights that we have experienced in this project. So let me start with the high-level vision of our BGNN work. So in many biological problems, we are working with 2 separate compartments of resources or knowledge, right? On one side, we have resources available in the form of image data, which is growing by the order of millions in many biological applications. For example, in biodiversity research, we have so much of images that are being collected from different sources. We have data that is being collected from museum and university library collections. For example, IDIC-Bio, GLIN. These are established networks of recording data in the form of images. And we also have a lot of excitement in the community on generating citizen science datasets. So these are crowdsourced datasets, for example, collected by tourists posting on social media through camera traps, through drones. So there is a vast richness of images, and it rightfully so. Images are now being considered as the new currency for biodiversity research. Right? So this is one source of knowledge that we have in some sense in biological problems. Our focus in the BGNN project is on understanding teleost fishes. The other compartment is the availability of existing scientific knowledge about teleost fishes, right? So that this knowledge is available in the form of different types of relationships between biological entities. For example, for teleost fishes, we have understanding of the phenotypic traits, for example, the different types of fins, and their properties that help distinguish between the different species. Right? We have knowledge about how the species are related to each other from the tree of life, from phylogenies. We have relationships between traits and species, and we have relationships between traits. right? And many a times, scientific knowledge in biology is expressed in the form of ontology. So here is just one example of an anatomy ontology, right? So a lot of research is happening in collecting more image data and in discovering new scientific knowledge, right? But these are the two compartments that have siloed in some sense. And there is an opportunity to bridge the gap between these two silos. So for example, given all of these images, would it not be interesting if we could automatically extract new scientific knowledge from these images, right? So we have a lot of trade data that is trapped or captured, locked in these images. What if we could unlock them and discover new relationships between the species, between traits and species, or between the traits? This is the high-level goal of our project on BGNN. We want to build machine learning models that can automatically extract new knowledge, harping on advances in deep learning that have revolutionized the field of computer vision, working with benchmark data sets, having millions or even more labeled images. Can we harness those recent advances in deep learning for a number of machine learning tasks, for example, for classifying species, for detecting traits, and even to segment the traits given these images, right? Once we are able to do that, it would lead to a lot of new knowledge, new insights that we would discover that is currently locked in these unlabeled large collections of images, right? So to solve this grand challenge, black box machine learning methods are unsuitable for several reasons. And these reasons are very similar to other research directions that are being explored in KGML2. So the first challenge that we experience is the extreme paucity of labels that we have for many of these machine learning tasks. For example, if we talk about the problem of trait segmentation, we have more than 100,000 images that we are currently working from a museum collection data set. And through our efforts, we have been able to annotate about 500 images out of these about 100,000 images, because labeling the traits in these images requires significant domain expertise, right? And it's time and labor intensive. Now, this is something that is in stark contrast of the scale of labels that we have in many benchmark computer vision problems that have been one of the key drivers for advances in deep learning. So in the paucity of labels, it's easy for a machine learning method to show poor generalization performance. Another major challenge that compounds this problem is the poor quality of data of images that we have in many real-world applications. For example, if we talk about museum collection images, which are still relatively more standardized than crowdsourced images, images collected in the wild, we still have a lot of challenges in dealing with several types of artifacts. For example, occlusions of traits. For example, a fin of a particular fish may be folded, or maybe the entire fish is folded, or maybe the image was taken vertically, not horizontally. Right? Now, all of these data quality issues further exacerbate the problem of poor generalization performance of black box machine learning methods that in the presence of these quality issues are susceptible to making spurious decisions. So this is the basic context driving our research in the spirit of KGML research, which is how can we augment black box machine learning methods using scientific knowledge available in this particular domain in the form of phylogenies and ontologies. And this is what we are referring to as the family of biology guided neural networks, or BGNNs. So in this talk, I'll talk about three very simple problems and how we are leveraging scientific knowledge for these problems. So the first problem that we have explored is of species classification. So we are given an image of a fish, and we can run it through a convolution neural network that can express a hierarchy of hidden features at the layers to finally predict the posterior probabilities of this image belonging to one of the species class. Right? And again, for this problem, the major challenge is the paucity of labels. Right? So, for example, from the university collection databases of images, more than about 450 out of 575 species have fewer than 30 images per species. Right? So we have very small amounts of data for most of the species. So to solve this problem, the type of biological knowledge that we are bringing to the table is relationships between the species expressed in the form of taxonomic or phylogenetic groupings. Right? So the key idea here is if we want to predict the species class, we know that the species classes are related to each other. Right? And this relationship is expressed in the form of phylogenetic trees or taxonomic groupings. For example, two species that share the same genus can be expected to share similar neural network features at its hidden layers. Right? So if I look at two different species belonging to the Neutropis genus, and if I take these two images and run it through a neural network, we would expect that these two species should express similar features at the hidden layers as opposed to images of species that belong to two different genus. Right? So this is the basic intuition that we want to bring in, which is the species-species relationship. Okay? And the ultimate goal here is to bridge the gap between the hierarchy of features that we are learning in deep learning models with known hierarchies in biology, for example, taxonomic groupings and phylogenies. Right? So this is the basis of a line of work that we are referring to as hierarchy-guided neural networks, where the hierarchy is coming from biological knowledge. And there are several ways to express this hierarchy. We present a very simple approach that has recently been accepted at Methods in Ecology and Evolution. So given any image of a fish, we can run it through two blocks of neural network layers. We can have some species features that help in predicting the species probabilities, and we can have another block that predicts the genus probabilities, having its own set of genus features, right? And for example, we can build two different convolution neural network blocks for these two problems, right? But we know that these two problems are related. Essentially, if we want to predict the species probabilities, we know that the features that we have already learned for predicting the right genus are useful to predict the right species, right? So this is informing the architecture of the top convolution neural network that is trying to predict the species probabilities using features expressed for a coarser scale problem of predicting the right genus. Right? So that this is a very simple idea of using genus level features for the problem of species classification. There are many more involved approaches that we are currently exploring using phylogenetic information rather than taxonomic groupings. But even this very simple idea is able to demonstrate that by using biological knowledge, we can obtain better accuracy, especially when the amount of labels is small, used for training, and especially when we know that the problem is hard. So here is a graph where we have data coming from two different data sets that we call as easy and hard. The easy one is obtained from a single museum and has a relatively simple collection of species and genre, whereas the hard has images from 5 different museums, and it has much more diversity in this set of species. What we can see is that for the hard data set, HGNN is able to show better accuracy. And for the easy data set, when we starve the data set with smaller number of images per species, that is when the power of bringing scientific knowledge in the form of HGNN really outperforms black box models. So this is just one line of evidence. There are many other ways to look at the performance of machine learning models. For example, by looking at saliency maps, which are essentially regions of the image that a neural network finds to be very interesting in solving the downstream machine learning task. So we'll be looking at these saliency maps and the species probabilities that we are predicting to look at a very interesting insight that we obtained, that by bringing in scientific knowledge, we can even achieve better robustness to adversarial attacks. Right? So here is a very simple adversarial occlusion, adversarial attack procedure that we explored, which is by occluding regions of the image that have the highest contribution to the saliency maps. Right? So for example, in this particular image, we are given the saliency map, and we are given the probabilities predicted by a black box model in KGML. We know that the first class here is the correct class, right? So we can see that both these models are doing fairly well. But what if I put a patch on the nose of this particular fish, which had the highest contribution to the saliency map, right? So we are essentially starving information, right, by occluding certain regions that the neural network finds most informative. Right? We can see that both these models take a hit, but the hit by the KGML model is much smaller in predicting the right class. And we can repeat this procedure several times, and we can see that in just 2 steps, the black box model is easily thrown off. The highest probability that it is predicting is for the 3rd class, which is incorrect. So this shows that by anchoring machine learning models with scientific knowledge, we can even be more robust to these occlusions that right now we are simulating adversarially, but can happen naturally in real world images because of the poor quality artifacts that we discussed in the beginning. Let me talk about another problem where we are looking at the problem of detecting traits. So given an image, we want to perform a multi-label classification of all of the different traits that are present or absent in this particular image. The challenge, of course, here is that we do not have trait labels at the level of individual specimens. Right? And this is where we can use another form of scientific knowledge, which is in the form of species trait occurrence matrices that are already provided to us by a domain expert. So for every species, we know which of the traits are present or absent in general for that particular species. This, of course, is known to be highly incomplete, but that's the exercise that we are currently working on to perform trait detection and even segmentation using species trait matrix and a small amount of high resolution trait segment labels. So in the interest of time, let me talk about a third application that we are exploring, which is to perform semantic segmentation of these images. So given an image of a fish, we want to identify all the interesting traits in the image. We would again face the challenge of paucity of training labels as we discussed in the beginning. So here is where we are exploring scientific knowledge available in the form of trait relationships. Right? So let me, in the interest of time, skip over this cartoon example and talk directly about the type of relationships that we are exploring here, which is for all of the traits that a neural network model is predicting on an unlabeled image, we can enforce whether those traits satisfy known spatial relationships between the traits. For example, we know that the pelvic fin is anterior to the caudal fin. Right? For any unlabeled image, if a machine learning model violates any of these relationships, then I know that I need to go back and retrain my model. So this is an ongoing work where we are making use of large volumes of unlabeled images and checking for consistency by querying anatomy ontologies and backpropagating that in our segmentation model. So just to summarize, this project explores a very interesting line of research in using a very diverse form of scientific knowledge available as ontologies. This adds to the richness of the ecosystem in KGML research, and there are several research needs that we need to explore going forward for KGML in aquatic sciences. So I would like to thank the entire BGNN team and the funding agencies and my wonderful group of students. Thank you.
Thanks, Anush. It's a really great compliment to the other types of research that we've been able to share in this session. Thanks again to all of our speakers and our poster presenters today for inspiring me, and I assume lots of other people today, for lots of different ways to do knowledge-guided machine learning. We're going to move now into our panel discussion. And so I'd like to invite my co-chair, Paul Hansen. He's already on video, and then all of the speakers and poster presenters to share your video and yeah, come online. I think that we're going to be able to, the AV people will be able to show all of our faces to the whole crowd in just a minute. And Paul and I are going to co-moderate this part, so I will turn it over to him to get us started with the first question once we start seeing a bunch of faces.
Great, thanks, Allison. And Anuj, I know you just hopped over from another workshop and conference, so only in this virtual world can one person attend multiple conferences simultaneously. So thanks to you, and also thanks to all the speakers and presenters of the posters for a great session. Okay, so I think, let's at least try it this way. Yeah, Allison and I have come up with a number of questions that we think will resonate with all of you. And we'll start with those and kind of see where the discussion goes. I think probably it's a good idea for you to use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and then we can call on you to kind of move the discussion around the room. So our first question for you is pretty general in nature, and considering that this workshop was motivated in large part by harnessing the data revolution and understanding that machine learning as well as KGML kind of techniques are an approach to harnessing the data revolution, we're wondering in what ways you're seeing the data revolution, or KGML in particular, change your research projects. Yeah, go ahead, Char, please.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, at least for actually a number of Department of Energy projects, is just the fact that machine learning has started to be part of the research norm now. Even there was a report that we wrote 5 years ago where the word machine learning, it was a cyber infrastructure report, didn't even appear once. And now it's like we're suddenly rewriting the report to think about how you incorporate this. So it's really revolutionized, I think, Earth system science and generally the modeling type of efforts, just because it's brought in so much energy and so many possibilities here. I would say that data management has become more important in many of our projects because we need the data. And so there's also all sorts of extra data related projects that have been spurred up, and things about data quality, lots of other challenges emerge in that field. So that's how our projects have changed.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the machine learning, not just growth, almost explosion of machine learning. And, to direct this question specifically at the graduate students and postdocs who are here, I'm just wondering if, machine learning, I assume, is something you're hearing a lot about, but in what ways is it beginning to sort of enter your research sphere, if at all?
Was that directed to me or everybody else?
No, it directed mostly at the graduate students and postdocs. Yeah, go ahead, Moritz. I gotta pay closer attention to the little symbols popping up.
So now I have sound. Hey, yeah, it's interesting because I started my PhD in 2018, and for me, it feels like it always has been like a major topic. And I also come not only from hydrology, but I also studied statistics. So for me, it always felt kind of natural. And it was very interesting when I spent 1 year in Calgary at the group of Masaki Hayashi. And there they mainly work with process-based modeling and a lot of field work. And it was very interesting to work with them together and have this different kind of perspective and try to fit these two different worlds. But in general, like now, for me, it feels like it always has been that way, even though for you, it's definitely more of a change.
Yep, fair enough. And Sam Oliver, I'm sorry to pick on you, but I know you've made the leap relatively recently from graduate school into agency work, and I bet you've seen a real big change in how quantitative techniques were applied when you were a graduate student versus what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think I was mostly exposed to statistical techniques and process-based models in graduate school, although we were beginning to dabble in machine learning, things like random forests. And so now I think the major change is actually, seeing collaborators modify the architecture of these machine learning approaches and not using just off-the-shelf algorithms to solve pretty complex problems. So yeah, that's been super interesting to watch develop.
From the Lake Expedition Group, I mean, you've obviously spent a lot of time on the collaborative process too. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, recently entered the realm of machine learning and thought about knowledge-guided machine learning. Are these really new topics to you, or are there conversations around topics of machine learning that are happening locally at your, universities? And I would say just go ahead and speak up. Marcia, go ahead.
I would say like you hear of them, particularly like some like things like random forest models. Definitely kind of familiar with the term, but it's still a bit inaccessible in terms of actually understanding. And that seems quite a leap to take without any guidance from like an expert. But at the same time, if I compare my undergraduate to now, like, which also isn't that long ago, there wasn't even a mention of it back then. Like I hadn't even heard of it. So it is evolving really quickly. And I feel that it will be the same for accessibility.
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in quickly as part of like the Lake Expedition Group, sorry, words. But yeah, my home institution down at Virginia Tech, we do a lot of modeling work, a lot of process-based modeling, but don't really think about machine learning. Like right now, none of our projects are machine learning based at the moment. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of, yeah, as part of Lake Expedition, get this experience and exposure to machine learning topics, and especially with this workshop, hearing about all the different types of, approaches and applications using machine learning in these different contexts, which I think could be really useful, and kind of bringing it back and maybe thinking about, incorporating that into some of the work we do.
Anuj, I know you've seen this both from the side of a graduate student and now from the side of a professor. And just having worked with you, and by coincidence, you're now at the same institution as Heather, who just spoke at Virginia Tech. I wonder what your perspectives are in working with graduate students and non-graduate students, really, from the domain sciences. You really have a big chasm to cross, at least initially, in going from ideas of computer science and machine learning into the domains.
Right. So I think in my experience, I've seen that there is a lot of openness now for machine learning research that I see with all of my collaborators, graduate students, as well as faculty members from different disciplines. And perhaps that is happening through KGML, which which sort of shows that machine learning is not a competitor, but an ally that we can work together. So I think that's definitely a change that I see. For graduate students, I think a lot of graduate students that I work with who are from different disciplines are, I think, now much more equipped with the basic tools in machine learning. Because I think for several reasons, I think things are becoming so easy to pick up online. That I think, for example, many of the students would send me some initial work with using state-of-the-art, off-the-shelf neural network models that they found pre-trained. They apply it on their results. They show me a Python notebook, and I'm impressed that they know the inner workings of these models to a certain extent. And of course, then we can start that project. So I feel like in these 4 years, at least, I see a lot of development that has happened.
Sharu, I see you smiling quite a lot in these kinds of responses. And I want to, and Allison, this one's for you too, talking with agency folks. And one of the big contrasts, at least I think I've noticed, is that agencies have the resources to be able to commit more people and integrate a little bit more fully some of these ideas and develop them and get a little bit kind of, get some momentum going. That's really hard to pull off, let's say, for one chapter of a graduate student thesis. Really operating at kind of different scales. So, Janet, I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, are you seeing a lot more of KGML kinds of activities in agencies, and is that a place of innovation as well as implementation, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot going on using KGML and, and straight black box machine learning in agency context. I was concurring earlier with Sam, like I finished my PhD not so long ago and there was like nothing about machine learning, some references to decision trees and random forests, but I think it's a little bit interesting, the comparison of, agency versus academic projects. I definitely think it does seem like there's some resources and sort of commitment and momentum, as you say, that can happen in the agency context. There's also a little bit, I think, in academia, there's some opportunities to explore some new ideas with less risk and consequence that, than we have in some of the agency contexts where it starts to become part of a bigger project and there's a bigger commitment, which has pros and cons to it. But it definitely seems to be growing on all fronts.
Yeah, Allison or Sharu, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think agencies, or at least the USGS where I am, have a feel of a bit of a train. Like we can gain momentum and we can maintain it, but it does take us a bit longer. And so, like Jordan Reed said yesterday in his talk on collaboration, we really rely heavily on academic collaborations to have some element of nimbleness, especially when things are changing so fast. But we also do have the resources to say, yes, this is what we're doing. We're going to do it and to make it happen.
Yeah, I'd concur, and I'd say that, at least from the Department of Energy side, there's just been so much momentum. They're going to have some workshops on, machine learning and incorporating it into Earth system science. I know NOAA or some of the other agencies have also had similar workshops in their fields. So that's something that we have tended to do, is to bring together people for our for our needs. I would say that one thing from the National Labs perspective is we are interdisciplinary teams by default. That's how we work. And so we have had a long history of collaborating with computer scientists across our projects. So it does make us, position ourselves well for just bringing together the, experts in this field and starting to think about that. So that's a bit of an added momentum because we've been working in this way pretty much from the start.
Robert, I'm not sorry to put you on the spot. I know you well. So you come at this topic from multiple perspectives. One is your graduate student training happened in Germany. You know lake physics and process-based model very thoroughly and deeply, and have implemented those in a number of different ways. You're involved in water quality modeling as well. And more recently, you've been working at the interface between those and machine learning. And as someone who is sort of, in that phase of a career between graduate school and a more permanent position, I'm wondering, how do you add something like machine learning to your arsenal of capacity and tools? And what are your thoughts on the process-based modeling that you know so deeply, and machine learning, which is sort of new to the scene?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, you want to stay like on top of your own domain science, plus you also want to improve your process-based modeling techniques. I mean, there's always something to learn. But on the other hand, you also have to delve into machine learning algorithms, because, I mean, you can use these out-of-the-box tools, but if you really want to be, I guess, at the edge of KGML, then you also have to go into like coding, scripting it yourself. You need the hardware also to run it, or at least like a high throughput computer center. So I think it's kind of tough after all these years of learning about how to model lakes with equations. Now we have to change to machine learning and get into it. But I think it's really important to make this change. So it seems like you need to know some basics about data science and machine learning, or you have to add this to your own skills, I guess, in the current times, because it seems like it's worth it.
Yeah, and maybe motivated a lot by the job market out there too. I've noticed a lot of job advertisements in a field where you normally would apply sort of basic limnological skills are now asking for data science. Are you seeing a similar kind of driving force out there in the job market? Robert?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, I mean, as a knowledgeist, mostly the job market is pretty limited. It's not that big, not that many open positions. And also it seems like the peak of process-based modeling is also gone, more or less. And now the next frontier is the data-driven or physics-guided machine learning, which seems to be, yeah, getting more and more momentum.
And Moritz, you're at a similar career stage. So I wonder if, but your background is a little bit different in that you've folded in machine learning as part of your graduate student work, whereas, I think probably a lot of people with a limnology background just haven't gotten to yet. But I assume, as you're looking forward in your career, you're seeing a lot of demand for people with that kind of skill set.
Yeah, that is definitely true. And so, but it's also a challenge, since I really like this like combination of hydrology or aquatic science and processes and understanding and machine learning applications. And yeah, I think there are a lot of positions, but I don't think there are necessarily a lot where you have necessarily both kind of parts equally, which is what I find most interesting. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, as we saw, I think, in most of the talks here. So yeah.
Shuki, in your poster, working on Lake Erkin, you're confronting a really difficult problem, which is, how do we predict things that have traditionally been extremely difficult to predict, like phytoplankton community, or harmful algal bloom development, or chlorophyll, even just chlorophyll concentration. And I think people are looking to new techniques to try to understand how we might be able to improve our predictions. So you're working in Sweden and working with a group at Uppsala and Lake Erkin. What are the perspectives that you're seeing in that group on embracing machine learning as a new tool?
Yeah, Yeah, so actually, I right now work for Uppsala, but personally, I am still in Canada because like this travel restriction, but I will arrive there soon. Yeah, so for this knowledge guide, machine learning is also a totally new page for me because for my PhD degree, I work on a process-based model, and I just start this machine learning project in Sweden this year. So it's a big challenge and totally new page for me. But I see a lot of challenge and as well as opportunity in this field because basically we are just start to using machine learning method and also the hybrid method combining the process-based model and machine learning together to investigate the water quality and as well as the biological issues like algal blooms in the water. So I see many academic institutes as well as the government willing to put a lot of effort and funding because into this area because I see at least in Sweden they have a data-driven approach, data-driven funding for this whole area. So I see a lot of opportunities in this area, and we need to explore it a lot of much further. Yeah, so I think right now for me it's a good opportunity as also a challenge in this area. Yeah.
Oh, terrific. And so a general question for the group is, what do you think your training and resources and communication challenges are, as we move forward to try to embrace topics like KGML? And I would say just go ahead and jump in or raise your hand if you'd rather. Yeah, go ahead, Moritz.
So one thing I noticed, especially when preparing the slides for you today, is that an issue is really the terminology when you talk to people from the science side and people from the machine learning side, since sometimes they're words have the same meaning, but they're totally different in machine learning or in hydrology or aquatic sciences. Just for example, like features or input variables. And those small things make presentation or just communication quite difficult and probably also could lead to misunderstanding. So I think this is quite a challenge, and yeah, I had to think a lot about this when preparing this presentation because I found myself just switching in between those two kind of ways of saying things.
I saw a hand briefly. Oh, Charo, yes.
Yeah, so one thing I've noticed, as you pointed out earlier, Paul, is that it's very hard to find people at this confluence who know the domain science as well as the statistics and machine learning, as well as can code and build efficient models. And so I find that you're usually very good at one thing, maybe somewhat good in the second, and then you don't really have much of a coding background because you've done work maybe with R or something, but not using Python. So I think there's a lot of training. Having good workflows, software workflows within the project is really important to get people up to speed about expectations, but you might also have to just give people some lead time if they have two things and they don't have the third to learn that extra thing. It does take a little bit of learning curve because you need everything to come together for this.
Yeah, that's good. Robert, yeah.
Yeah, also to pick this up, I also think team science, also the Lake expedition has mentioned before, is really important. So you need to have a team of collaborators to work together and then to approach this, I think. I think that's the only way forward that you can achieve something in a short time frame, especially for KGML.
Allison, yeah. Thanks, Robert. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise my hand so I could close us out here because we reached our time. That was a really lively conversation. Thank you to you all for joining this panel and providing your really useful insights on what it's like to be at this intersection of everything all at once. I loved this session. It was really great to hear from all of you. And as you know, the the talks will be recorded and the posters are going to be available. So if you missed anything or you want to revisit anything, the resources are there, and I hope you will, and I hope you'll engage your fellow presenters and attendees in the future to do more of this. If Paul doesn't have any last words, do you? I think we're about ready to wrap it up.
Just a huge thank you. So,
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Yep. Bye.